A hand. Just a hand. Reaching up through the snow like something the mountain refused to keep. The blood had already frozen. Somewhere above the tree line, 3 men rode south and did not look back. They had left something behind someone, and the calculation had been simple. Winter finishes what men start. They were wrong. The Rocky Range in December does not forgive. It does not negotiate. It buries what it is given and holds it until spring. Except this time it didn't hold. A rope, a woman who had no reason to stop, and a mountain man who had spent 4 years learning how to survive everything except being found. He should have died out there. He didn't. And the 3 men who rode south were about to discover what happens when the mountain sends something back. The first thing Holt Danver heard was his own breathing. Not the wind, not the creak of pine under ice weight. His own breathing, shallow and wrong. The kind a man makes when his body has already started the math on whether it's worth continuing. The sound came from somewhere below him, muffled by 6 inches of packed snow pressing against his chest, his shoulders, the left side of his face. His right hand was above the surface. He knew because he could feel the cold differently there. Not the deep cold of burial, the sharp cold of open air. He tried to make a fist, so he tried again. 2 fingers moved, barely, just enough to scrape against the crust of ice that had formed over the snow's surface. And the scraping sound was the loneliest sound he'd ever heard, which was saying something because Holt Danver had spent 4 winters on a mountain where the only voice was wind. He remembered the fire at the base camp. The way Boyd Hackett's pocket watch had caught the light when the man pulled it out and checked the time like they were waiting on a stagecoach, instead of standing over a man they'd just beaten half to death. Gold case, initials engraved, BRH, the H for Hackett presumably, though Holt had not spent much time thinking about what the R stood for. He'd spent most of his conscious moments in that camp, thinking about the fact that Hackett's voice had been entirely calm when he'd given the instruction. The mountain'll do the rest of the work. Hackett had said it the way a man says close the gate or check the water barrel. Practical, unbothered, like disposing of a witness was just another item on the morning list. Then the boots had crunched away through the snow and there was nothing. That had been Holt tried to calculate somewhere between 2 hours ago and forever. Time did strange things when your blood temperature was dropping. He knew that from trapping. He'd pulled animals from ice before, and there was always a moment when they stopped fighting and just looked at him with something that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite resignation but was somewhere in that territory. He'd always tried to work fast when he saw that look. He did not want to give himself that look. His shoulder moved, just barely, but it moved. The snow around his chest was the problem. Packed in dense from the weight of what Big Ven and Creed had pushed in on top of him after they'd dragged him to the hollow. He could reconstruct it well enough now that his mind was starting to function again. Natural depression in the terrain, maybe 4 feet deep, the kind that fills first in a storm and holds longest into spring. They'd known exactly where to put him, which meant they'd scouted it, which meant this had not been improvisation. That detail made him angrier than the beating did. The anger was useful. Anger used oxygen. And oxygen was not something he had in abundance, but it also moved blood, and blood was the only currency that mattered right now. He turned the anger into pressure against his left arm, pushed, felt the snow give just slightly, and kept pushing until something in his shoulder screamed, and he stopped pushing and breathed through the screaming until it settled back to a manageable noise. The sky above his right hand was gray. The specific gray of afternoon in December at elevation when the clouds sit so low you could theoretically reach up and push a finger through them. He'd seen that sky 10,000 times from higher up, from his cabin where the ridgeline cut across the horizon, and the only thing between him and the weather was whatever he'd built or trapped or cured himself. He knew this sky the way he knew the grain of the wood he'd used to patch his north wall last September, intimately, without affection. It was the kind of sky that preceded snow by roughly 90 minutes if the wind held. He needed to be out of this hole before the wind stopped holding. His right arm moved, really moved this time. He got the elbow down and used it as a limb, and the snow on his right side shifted, and his shoulder came up, and the packed crust around his chest cracked in one long line like something had decided to let him try. Thinking took energy. He just kept the pressure going. Found another inch, then another, until his torso was tilted enough that gravity started working with him instead of against him. He got his chin above the surface. The air hit his face like the flat of a blade. His eyes, which had been pressed shut against the ice, opened and found nothing immediately useful, just white. The hollow's edge about 18 inches above his head. The trunks of 2 lodgepole pines at the rim dark and indifferent. A patch of sky through the branches. and his own right hand lying in the snow beside his head, the knuckles split and dark with dried blood that had frozen sometime in the past several hours. He looked at the hand for a moment. Then he started working on getting the rest of himself out. It took longer than it should have. His left boot kept catching on something below the surface. A root or a buried rock. And twice he slid back down after gaining 6 inches of progress. And the second time he lay face down in the snow with his eyes closed and had a very clear, very specific conversation with himself about whether this was going to be the end of it. The conversation was brief. He had it the way he'd had most important decisions in the past 4 years, which was alone, without drama, and with a ruthless impatience for self-pity. He was not done yet. He got out, rolled onto his back at the rim of the hollow, lay there with his chest heaving and the cold burning down his throat with every inhale, staring up through the pine branches at that flat gray sky. Something in his left side was wrong. Not broken wrong, probably, but the kind of wrong that would make the next several hours interesting. His face felt twice its normal size on the left side. He lifted his hand and touched his jaw carefully, and the sharp spike of pain confirmed that whatever Creed had used on him for the last hit had done some meaningful work. He sat up. The camp was gone. Hackett's men had cleared it efficiently, which again suggested planning, and the only evidence that 4 men had spent 3 days in this spot was the disturbed snow around the fire pit and the drag marks leading to the hollow's edge. Holt's pack, his snowshoes were gone, the supply sled was gone. What remained? Because they hadn't bothered to search him thoroughly enough. Were the things on his body. His skinning knife in the sheath on his right hip. The short-barreled Colt in the holster under his left arm inside the coat. And the strip of rawhide around his neck with the small piece of carved pine hanging from it. He didn't touch the pine piece. He just registered that it was still there. The wind was coming from the northwest. He turned his face into it for a moment, reading it the way he'd learned to read wind at elevation. Still steady. Maybe 70 minutes before the direction shifted and the snow started. He needed to move south and downhill, toward the valley, toward the lower tree line where the snow would be shallower, and the chances of encountering a trail increased. His body's vote on this plan was various and contradictory, but his body did not get a deciding vote. He stood up, found the south, started moving. He was perhaps 40 minutes into walking, moving slow but consistent, following the line of least resistance through the timber, when the horse stopped 30 yards ahead of him and looked directly at him with the focused attention of an animal that has detected something requiring classification. Holt stopped too. The horse was a dark chestnut, still saddled, reins dropped and trailing in the snow. Good-sized animal, mountain-bred from the look of the hooves, which were heavy and well-shaped for terrain like this. A coil of rope hung from the saddle horn in a loop that someone had tied with a Honda knot, which was a working knot, not a decorative one. Saddlebags, a bedroll strapped behind the seat, and across the saddle a Winchester rifle in a scabbard with the stock facing left, which meant the rider drew with their right hand and mounted from the left. All of this Holt catalogued in approximately 4 seconds, because 4 years of trapping had made him fast at reading things that had stories to tell. The rider came from behind him. He heard the snow compress differently under a human foot than under an animal's, and he heard it a quarter second before a voice came, "Don't," and then a pause, and the voice again, "Whatever you're thinking, just don't." He turned slowly. She was standing about 12 feet back, and she had a rifle, not the Winchester from the scabbard. A separate one she'd been carrying up and pointed at him with the posture of someone who had held a rifle enough times that it wasn't a gesture. It was a position. Her right eye was closed, and her left eye was open, and looking down the barrel at him with the specific patience of someone who had learned to wait out what needed waiting. Regan Cross was 25 years old, and nothing about her appearance suggested she needed anyone to hold anything for her. She wore a vest of dark red-brown leather over a flannel shirt the color of deep water, and her riding skirt was heavy black wool, double-layered at the knees, the kind designed for a woman who spent more time on horseback than on floors. Her boots had the narrow heel and the worn spur straps of actual daily use, not display. Her hat, a wide-brimmed brown felt, sat slightly left of center in the particular way of someone who jammed it on in a hurry and never straightened it. The hatband was braided leather with a single piece of turquoise. Her hair was dark brown and had been braided at some point today, but the braid had mostly given up, and several inches of it were loose around her collar in the cold air. She looked at him the way people look at problems they haven't decided how to solve yet. Holt kept his hands visible and low. His right hand was nowhere near the Colt under his coat. His left hand was in front of him at waist height. He said nothing because he had nothing useful to say, and the woman with the rifle seemed like someone who would find unnecessary words annoying. She took 3 seconds, then the rifle came down a few inches. Not all the way, enough to indicate that she was recategorizing him from immediate threat to something that required more information. "You came from uphill," she said. "What's uphill from here besides the Hackett claim site?" It wasn't a question, it was a test. "I was the guide," Holt said. 4 days ago I brought 3 men up to survey Hackett's men. Last night they put me in a hole and filled it with snow and left them." She looked at him for a long moment with the quality of attention that people give things they're deciding whether to believe. Her eyes were a blue-gray that the flat light made almost silver. Them. And they moved over him with the same systematic thoroughness he'd just given her horse. The dried blood on his jaw. Them. The tilt of his coat where the left side was favoring a damaged rib. Them. The split knuckles. Them. The 40 minutes of walking in the wrong direction for a man planning to hide anything. The rifle came down the rest of the way. She didn't lower it to the ground. She carried it at her side with the barrel pointed down, which was the position of someone who'd made a decision but wasn't filing it away permanently. "Boyd Hackett," she said. "That's the name he gave me. I know where the deposit is. I mapped it in my head on the way up. I wasn't hired to forget." Holt paused. Something in his left side reminded him of itself. He breathed through it without showing it on his face, which took a specific effort he was quietly proud of. "He needed me gone before I could tell anyone the location. A formal staking claim needs a surveyor's report and a witness signature. He can't file without those. But he can build toward it while I'm dead." Regan was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the high branches above them with a sound like something exhaling slowly. "Then you need help getting down the mountain." "I need a horse," Holt said. "And about 6 hours. You need more than that." She was looking at the side of his face without any attempt to be subtle about it. "You're going to need that side looked at, and you're walking like something in your ribs is rubbing against something it shouldn't." She tilted her head toward Dusty. "My ranch is 3.5 miles south. My father's in Coldridge. So it's just the ranch and the problem of getting you there. I can manage." She said it back to him flat, without inflection or warmth. "Sure, them. You can manage 40 minutes of mountain trail after being buried in snow and beaten. And then when you manage yourself into a ditch somewhere between here and the valley, I can manage explaining to your family why I didn't help you when I had a horse and a rope right here." A short pause. "Do you have family?" He didn't answer right away. "No," he said. She nodded once, without sympathy and without prying. "Then manage yourself onto the saddle. Dusty won't like it, but he'll hold them." The horse, Dusty, turned his head and looked at Holt with the enormous and deeply skeptical eye of a horse who has formed opinions. Holt got himself onto the saddle. It took 2 attempts and produced a sound from his ribs that he was glad no one could hear. Them. Once up, the view from the horse's back was different from the view at ground level, and what it showed him was how close the clouds had come in the past 10 minutes. The cloud ceiling had dropped another 300 feet while he'd been walking. The snow was maybe 50 minutes out now, maybe less. "How fast can you move this horse through powder?" he asked. Regan had already gathered the trailing reins and was holding them out to him, not looking at him. Looking at the sky to the northwest with the same reading of conditions attention he'd been giving it himself. "Faster than you can walk," she said. "That's the relevant comparison." She started south through the timber without further conversation. And Holt followed on Dusty because there was nothing else logical to do, and because his available alternatives were limited and diminishing by the minute. They moved through the trees in silence for a while. The kind of silence that happens between people who have no context for each other yet and know it, and who are both practical enough not to fill it with noise. The pine trunks were thick on both sides, close enough together that the trail through them was more suggestion than fact. But Regan moved through it with the particular ease of someone who had ridden this ground enough times to carry its shape internally. She didn't check the trees for landmarks the way a person would in unfamiliar terrain. She just moved, and the route resolved itself under her feet. Holt watched the back of her hat and the way she read the ground and didn't say anything for about a quarter mile. Then the snow started. Not the tentative beginning of storm scattering. Actual snow, the kind that comes with intent, fine and fast and horizontal, because the wind had shifted exactly as he'd predicted and was now driving it from the northwest into their faces. Regan pulled her hat down and angled her shoulders and kept walking. Dusty pinned his ears back but didn't slow, which was the behavior of a horse that had been through worse and kept moving because his owner expected it. "Path gets narrow in about 200 yards, Regan said without turning around. Her voice was clear over the wind because she'd pitched it right, not shouting but projecting. Another skill that came from working outdoors. Ledge section. Stone to the left, drop to the right. About 50 feet of it. You'll want to lean inward and let Dusty pick the footing. I know how to ride a ledge trail, Holt said. She didn't respond to that, which was probably the right response. The ledge section arrived, and it was exactly what she'd described. The trail narrowed to the width of one horse, the rock face rising to the left and the slope falling away steeply to the right, snow-covered so there was no visual indication of how far down it went before it stopped. Holt kept his weight inward and let Dusty read the ground, and Dusty proved he knew exactly what he was doing, planting each hoof with the precise deliberation of an animal who understood the physics of his situation. Regan was ahead of them on foot for this section, one hand trailing along the rock face without gripping it, using it as a reference point. Her spur straps caught the light once when she turned slightly to check on them, and then she was past the turn and waiting at the wider section beyond it. When Dusty stepped out onto the wider trail, Regan looked up at Holt with an expression that contained several things she didn't say. "Half a mile," she said instead. They made it with the snow coming harder and the light going flat, and when the cabin appeared through the trees, it was the warm yellow glow of a banked fire visible through the south-facing window that Holt saw first. Low structure, thick-walled log, the roof overhanging deep on all four sides the way mountain country buildings were built by people who understood what snow weight did to inadequate overhangs. A barn 50 feet to the east, the fence line just visible beyond it. Woodpile stacked high against the east wall of the cabin, enough there to indicate someone who'd been cutting and stacking since October. People who knew what winter cost came prepared for it. Regan took Dusty's reins and led the horse to the barn, without asking Holt to help or explaining what she was doing, and Holt got himself down from the saddle, which was a production he chose to conduct facing away from her. By the time she'd settled the horse and come back out, he was standing in front of the cabin door, in what he considered an acceptably vertical posture. She looked at him. "You can come in on your own, or I can help you in. Either one." "I'm in," he said, and opened the door, and went in. The inside of the cabin was the inside of a place where people actually lived, which was different from the inside of places where people merely stayed. The difference was in the 1,000 small accumulations of actual inhabitation. The iron pot hanging on its hook over the fireplace, with the faint smell of something that had been cooked in it recently still in the air. The pair of work gloves on the table beside a length of harness leather and an awl. The boots by the door. The herb bundles hanging from the ceiling beam to dry. Chamomile and something darker. And the shelf along the north wall with its collection of practical objects arranged with the unconscious order of someone who always put things back in the same place. There was one bed, against the east wall, solid framed with a quilt that someone had made by hand over a long winter. Holt looked at it and then looked away because it was somebody's bed and he was nobody to anybody here. "Sit," Regan said. She was at the fireplace building the fire back up from the banked coals without looking at him. The chair, not the bed, not yet. He sat in the chair, which was a straight-backed wooden one near the table, and put his hands on his knees, and looked at the fire catching and said nothing. She boiled water, pulled a tin box from the shelf that rattled with the sound of dried things inside it, tore a length of clean linen from a folded piece of cloth she kept in the chest at the foot of the bed. The efficiency of her movements was not hurried. She didn't rush. She sequenced correctly, which was harder and more useful than rushing, and she did it without the self-conscious performance of someone who needed you to notice how capable she was. Holt noticed anyway. "Take the coat off," she said, not to be unkind, because she couldn't see what needed looking at while he was wearing it. He got the coat off, which required not showing on his face what the left side cost, and he mostly managed it. The coat was his trapper's coat, long and heavy, river otter and elk hide, made in the first autumn after he'd gone up the mountain, because the coat he'd brought with him wasn't sufficient for what the mountain actually was. He'd spent 6 weeks on that coat. He draped it over the back of the chair. Regan looked at his left side. Then she put her hand out and pressed 2 fingers lightly against his ribs below the armpit. He did not make a sound. He was not going to make a sound. She pressed again, slightly lower, and something in his jaw tightened without his permission. She moved her fingers again. 2, she said, maybe 3. "You won't know without a doctor, and there's no doctor here. But the way you breathe tells me 2 for certain." She stepped back. "I can wrap it. It'll hurt less once it's wrapped." "I know," he said. "You've done this before twice. Once my own doing, once a bear's." She looked at him for half a second with the expression of someone filing something away. Then she started with the linen strip and the wrapping, and she was efficient about that too. And it hurt exactly as much as it was going to hurt, and then it was done, and the difference was immediate, and he let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding flat. The face needs cleaning, she said. The face is fine. The face has a cut above the ear that's going to close wrong if it's not cleaned. She didn't ask them. She brought the warm water and the cloth and cleaned it, and he sat still for it because arguing would have taken more energy than cooperating. Her hands were deft and sure, the hands of someone used to treating animals that couldn't explain where it hurt, which translated reasonably well to treating a man who didn't want to explain anything. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at her work in the firelight. He looked at her in the same firelight. "Holt Danver," he said. "I heard you the first time." She'd already said his name once, back on the mountain, though he hadn't introduced himself before that point. She'd known his name. He noted that. "You knew who I was before I told you." Boyd Hackett's operation put flyers out 2 months ago looking for a mountain guide who knew the northern range. Your name came up in Coldridge. People talk. She picked up the linen scraps and the tin box and put them back where they came from with the same automatic accuracy as everything else in this space. My father heard it and didn't like it. He didn't like the source. What source? A man from Denver, well-dressed, carrying more money than any legitimate surveying job could explain. She turned from the shelf. "Hackett, your father has land near the northern range. My father has land the northern range happens to be next to." The distinction was in her voice, careful and specific. He was approached about selling the western tract. 3 months ago, when he said no, his deed paperwork started disappearing from the county recorder's office, twice. She looked at the fire and then back at him. Boyd Hackett is not in the business of taking no for an answer. Holt sat with that for a moment. His ribs were wrapped and his face was cleaned, and the fire was up and outside the snow was coming down with serious intent now, and the picture that had started forming in the hollow on the mountain was getting clearer in a way he didn't entirely like. A man like Hackett didn't move on one target at a time. A man like Hackett built a map and then acquired everything on it piece by piece until the picture only made sense from above, where you could see how all the individual pieces connected. "How many ranches in this valley?" he said. 7 operating. 3 that sold in the past year. Sold or got sold. She looked at him without answering, which was its own kind of answer. Holt leaned forward in the chair and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the fire. The piece of carved pine on the rawhide strip swung forward when he leaned, cleared the collar of his shirt hung in the warm air of the cabin. He looked at it. The letter M, carved shallow but precise, the kind of carving you do slowly because you have time and intention. He pushed it back against his chest with 2 fingers and held it there for a moment. May would have had something direct to say about all of this. She had always been direct in the way that people are direct when they don't have patience for the long way around to the truth. She would have said something about Hackett that was accurate and short and would have made him almost smile in spite of the situation. She wasn't here to say it. She hadn't been here for 4 years. He pressed the pine piece flat against his sternum with his palm and held it there until the specific ache of that particular thought settled back into the general background noise where he usually kept it. Outside, the storm had committed. The wind against the north wall of the cabin was a continuous sound now, not gusting but sustained, and the temperature had dropped enough that the window had started to condense. The fire was the only useful light, and it made everything in the cabin orange and close and private. "You're going to need to stay tonight," Regan said. She was at the stove now, doing something that involved the iron pot and the smell of something with onion in it. "The trail is impassable in this, and you'd freeze before you got to the valley road. I'm aware my father will be back tomorrow. He'll have questions, I'll answer them. He doesn't ask questions the easy way, neither do I." Holt looked at the fire. "I'll manage your father." There was a silence. And then she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Low and brief. Gone before he could be certain he'd heard it at all. The storm ran its full course over the next several hours. Holt ate the food she'd made, which was better than what he'd been eating on the mountain for the past 4 days by a significant margin. And they sat in the cabin with the fire between them and the storm outside and talked about practical things, the layout of the northern range, the specific drainage patterns that would affect the trail from Hackett's position to this ranch, the timeline of how long it would take Hackett's party to get back to Coldridge and what they would do when they got there. He did not talk about May. She did not ask. She asked about the deposit. He told her what he knew, which was considerable, because he had spent 3 days helping Hackett's surveyor map a site that he had been studying on his own for 2 seasons before Hackett found him. The deposit was small by Denver standards but large by any other standard he cared to apply. Enough to make a man like Hackett do exactly what Hackett had done. Enough to explain the land purchases, the missing deeds, the deputy in Coldridge who her father had mentioned once over supper, Lars, who had been receiving packages from a Denver address since September. "You know about Lars," she said. "I know what people in the hills know, which is usually more than people in the towns know, because people in the hills pay attention to what comes and goes." She looked at him with something that was recalibrating in real time. "How long have you been up there?" 4 years. "Why?" She asked it without preamble and without the softening that people usually applied to that question, the hesitation and the implicit apology for prying. She just asked it, straight, the way she'd done everything else, and the bluntness of it was such that answering it felt easier than deflecting. "I had a reason to stay down," he said, "and then I didn't, and the mountain was simpler." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the fire. "The mountain is not actually simpler," she said. "It's just quieter." He didn't answer that. The wind dropped around midnight, not completely but enough. Regan banked the fire for the night with the practiced economy of someone who'd done it every night of her adult life. She gave him the quilt from the bed and took the second blanket from the chest for herself. And she took the bed, which was her bed, without discussion. And he took the floor near the fire with his coat folded under his head, and his knife still in its sheath because old habits of security didn't stop operating just because you were inside. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind diminish, and thought about Boyd Hackett riding back to Coldridge tomorrow morning in the conviction that the problem of Holt Danver had been efficiently resolved by the mountain. He thought about what it would look like when Hackett discovered that the mountain had failed. He thought about the land map in his head, the way the northern range drainage ran, the way the creek bed that bordered the west edge of this ranch was precisely one ridgeline south of where the deposit site was. The way that someone who owned this land would have a legitimate claim to make, with the right documentation and a witness who knew the mountain, that would be considerably more credible than Hackett's by-night approach. He thought about Warren Cross coming home tomorrow. He thought about the fact that the first intelligent thing Hackett would do, when he got back to Coldridge and found out Holt was still alive, would be to come looking for him. And the first place Hackett would look, once he tracked the trail in the snow, would be here. He touched the piece of pine against his chest once in the dark. Then he stopped thinking about it and made himself sleep, because rest was not optional and tomorrow was going to require everything he had. Outside, the storm had run its full weight against the valley and was retreating north, the way December storms in the Rocky Range did when they'd said what they had to say. What it left behind was not silence exactly. The snow had its own voice, the settling of it, the compression under its own weight, the particular creak of tree branches adjusting to a new load. Holt had learned to read that voice the way he'd learned to read every other voice the mountain spoke in, and what it told him now was that the trail south would be passable by first light if a person knew where to step. He lay still and did not sleep yet because his ribs were talking to him, in a low continuous complaint that made the left side of his chest feel inhabited by something disapproving. He breathed through it. He had learned to breathe through things. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the faint salt iron smell of the linen wrap around his ribs and something else underneath all of it. The particular clean smell of a well-kept space that people slept in and worked in and ate in for years until the walls absorbed the whole of their daily life and gave it back as warmth. He hadn't been in a space like that in a long time. His cabin on the mountain smelled of trapping and solitude and whatever he'd cooked most recently, and nothing else, because there was nothing else in it. He didn't miss what was absent, except occasionally, in specific moments, without warning he did, He heard Regan Cross shift once in the dark, the way a person shifts when they're not fully asleep but not fully awake either, the sounds of a person who is thinking about something and trying to stop. He didn't know what she was thinking about. He assumed it was practical. From the past several hours she had struck him as someone whose thoughts were mostly practical, and whose feelings got expressed in what she did rather than what she said, which was a trait he had strong respect for and also, if he was being precise about it, considerable familiarity with. He thought about her pulling him out of the hollow. He hadn't seen it happen because he'd been only intermittently conscious through the process, but he'd been aware of it in the fragmented way of a person whose brain is operating on emergency systems. The rope, the specific mechanical competence of how she'd looped and set it, the horse's breathing changing as the load came on. The way the snow around his chest had finally given them. And the cold air had hit the part of him that had been buried them. And the difference between buried cold and open-air cold had felt them, for about 3 seconds, like something worth living for. He didn't examine that too closely. What he did examine, lying in the dark with his ribs unhappy and his face stiff on the left side where the swelling had settled, was the practical problem of Boyd Hackett. The man had made a mistake, but he'd made it in a particular way that suggested he would not recognize it as a mistake until he had direct evidence. Hackett was used to problems resolving the way he planned for them to resolve. He had enough money and enough men, and enough confidence in his own planning to believe that when he set a thing in motion it would arrive at the expected destination. The mountain was supposed to take Holt Danver and the mountain had not cooperated, but Hackett didn't know that yet. That was a window, not a large one, but a window. He thought about what needed to happen in it. He thought about the county recorder's office in Coldridge and the man who ran it, a clerk named Billings who'd been in the job for 11 years and who Holt had spoken with exactly once, 3 years ago, when he'd come down from the mountain in April to file his trapping license renewal. Billings had been the kind of meticulous and slightly nervous man who cared about paperwork with genuine passion, which meant he was either Hackett's perfect tool or Hackett's worst nightmare, depending on whether Billings had been reached or not. If the deeds were going missing, Billings was either in on it or being circumvented. Either way, it needed addressing directly. He thought about Ed Pryor and the Coldridge Courier, which he knew existed because the trapper who ran the winter supply cache at the junction sometimes had copies in the spring, 6 months old and stiff from cold but still legible. Pryor had been running that paper for 30 years and had the reputation of a man who had outlasted several people who'd found his coverage inconvenient. He thought about the U.S. Marshal's office in Cannon City. He thought about how long it would take to get a rider from Coldridge to Cannon City at a reasonable pace in current trail conditions. He thought about the 2 days that represented. He thought about Hackett's timeline. Then he stopped thinking and breathed carefully around his ribs and made himself sleep, because there was nothing he could do about any of it in the dark of Regan Cross's cabin at midnight in a December storm. And rest was the only thing he could actually acquire right now that would help with everything else later. He slept. He dreamed about fire, which he always did when he slept deeply enough to dream, and he woke from it at some point in the very early morning, the hour when the dark is deepest before it starts to gray, and lay for a moment with his hand over the carved pine piece on his chest, and his eyes on the low glow of the banked fire, and let the dream finish draining. May, the smell of the smoke, the way the orange had been visible 3 miles out on the road and he'd pushed the horse and pushed it, and it hadn't been enough, and it was never going to have been enough, because the fire had started 6 hours before he'd seen the light of it. He knew all of this. He had known all of this for 4 years. He pressed the pine flat and closed his eyes again. Outside, the mountain breathed in and out with the wind from the north. In the first gray of actual morning, the smell of coffee. He opened his eyes. The fire was fully up again, and Regan Cross was at the stove in the same clothes she'd slept in with her braid retied neatly at her neck, a practical early morning reordering of herself. And the coffee was in a tin pot, and the sound of it was the specific small percussion of a well-managed morning. She'd been up long enough to rebuild the fire from the banked coals and put water on, and do whatever else she'd done before he heard any of it, which meant she moved quietly when she wanted to, or she'd woken early enough that he'd slept through the beginning of her morning. He sat up. His ribs reminded him of themselves. He ignored them and looked at the window, which showed him gray light and snow-laden trees and the absence of additional snowfall. "Trail's clear enough," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the coffee pot with the attention of someone waiting on something. "If we're going to move before Hackett has time to backtrack our trail, it's this morning. My father will be back by midday," she said. She poured coffee into 2 cups, heavy tin cups with the dents of daily use in them, and set one on the table within his reach. "He'll have things to say. You mentioned. I'm not warning you," she said clearly. "I'm telling you, so you know what's coming." He picked up the cup. The coffee was hot and black and real, not the burnt grain substitute he'd been making on the mountain since October when his supply ran low. He drank it and said, "I'll be here." She looked at him over the rim of her own cup. "You're sure someone used me to find that deposit and then tried to bury me with it? I'm not going back up the mountain until that's settled." She held his gaze for a moment. What was in her expression was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. Something between them, the recalibration of a person updating what they expected to be true. Then she put her cup down and went to deal with the horses. And the day, which was going to be consequential, began. Warren Cross rode in at 10:30, which was 90 minutes earlier than Regan had predicted, and 30 minutes before Holt had finished mentally rehearsing the conversation. He heard the horse before the door opened, a heavier animal than Dusty, slower cadence, the particular rhythm of a horse that has been ridden hard for several days, and is making its opinion known with every hoofall. Then the door opened and Warren Cross came in, and he was exactly what the cabin suggested he would be, a man built by decades of physical work into something that looked less like aging and more like compressing, the way certain kinds of wood get harder as they dry. His vest was gray wool, travel-stained at the shoulders. His hat came off when he stepped inside, automatic as breathing, and underneath it his hair was fully white, and his face was the color and texture of someone who had not spent much of his 60 years under a roof. He looked at Holt. He looked at his daughter. He set his hat on the hook by the door and said, "Boyd Hackett." Not a question, not quite a statement. A weight he was setting down in the middle of the room. Regan was at the stove. She didn't stop what she survived the night. 2 ribs, maybe 3. The face will heal them. Warren moved to the table and sat in the chair across from Holt, with the deliberate economy of a man conserving something. And he looked at Holt with the specific attention of someone who had spent a portion of his life assessing other men under pressure. Whatever he saw, he was quiet about his assessment for a full 10 seconds. Then, "Where's the deposit?" told him. Not everything. The essential coordinates, the drainage orientation, the rough size of the visible vein. Enough for Warren to understand the geometry of why his land mattered to Hackett's plan. Warren listened without interrupting. When Holt finished, Warren folded his hands on the table and looked at them. His knuckles had the enlarged joints of someone who had broken his hands at least once and worked through it. 3 ranches sold this year, he said. Henderson in March, the Pittman widow in June, Aldred's place in September, all west of the creek line. He looked up. "I thought it was coincidence." "It wasn't," Holt said. "No." Warren looked at his hands again. "It wasn't." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite anger. Anger was hot. This was cold. The cold, specific thing that happens when a man understands that he has been the subject of a plan he didn't know about. The deed trouble started in August. "Regan told you." "She told me." "I had the same thought." Warren was quiet again. The fire said what it said. Outside, a branch released its snow load with a soft concussive sound. Then Warren Cross looked at his daughter's back and said, "You brought him in." Regan turned from the stove with 2 plates. She set one in front of her father and one in front of Holt and went back for the third. "He was in a hole in the snow," she said. It seemed relevant to address. It was relevant to address, Warren said, and something in how he said it closed the topic in the way of someone who has made a decision about a person and moved on. He picked up his fork. They ate in the working silence of people with things to figure out. The food was salt pork and fried cornbread, and the last of something preserved from summer that Holt couldn't identify exactly but ate without comment because it was warm, and his body was treating every calorie as a personal favor. Warren ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had skipped at least 1 meal in the past day. Regan ate standing because the table only had 2 chairs and she hadn't gone looking for the third. Holt watched that without comment. He pushed his chair back and stood up. His ribs registered their objection. He found the third chair himself, against the north wall under the coats, and brought it to the table and set it down across from himself. Regan looked at the chair. Then at him she sat. Warren watched this exchange with no expression at all, which was a very particular kind of expression. After a moment, Warren said, "The county recorder, Billings." "I was thinking about Billings," Holt said. "Billings is not Hackett's man. He's a frightened man, which is different and in some ways worse." Warren set his fork down. "Someone has been getting into the recorder's office after hours. The lock on the back window was broken in July, fixed in August, broken again in September. Billings reported it both times. Lars took the report and did nothing. So the deeds aren't destroyed," Regan said. "They're just missing, which means they can be found if someone goes looking in the right way. Or filed again if the originals are gone," Holt said. "The land survey records are different from the deed records. If the survey plats are intact, you can make a case for the deed boundaries even without the original deed document." Warren looked at him with a reassessment happening behind his eyes. "You know land law. I know enough. I filed my own trapping territory claims 4 years running. The process taught me the pressure points." Holt picked up his coffee. "Hackett's not filing legitimately. He's building a fraudulent history of ownership through the recorder's office. But that requires someone on the inside to make the insertions look authentic. Billings isn't doing it. Which means someone is getting in around Billings. Deputy Lars has a key," Regan said. The three of them sat with that for a moment. Then Regan set her fork down with a precision that meant she was done with food and moving on to the next thing. Ed Pryor, she said. Warren looked at her. He's been in Coldridge 30 years, she said. He knows every piece of public record in that town because he reported on all of it. If we go to him with what we know before Hackett gets back to town and puts his version of events first, we control what the town hears. Pryor's one man with a printing press, Warren said. Pryor's one man with a printing press and 30 years of people in this county reading what he writes and deciding what to think about it. She said it without raising her voice. Hackett has laws and money. We have the truth in Ed Pryor. In Coldridge, that's not a bad trade. Warren looked at his daughter for a long moment. The look of a man seeing something he'd watched develop over years and occasionally forgot to notice. Then he turned to Holt. You willing to put your name on it? In print? I'm the only witness to what happened on that mountain, Holt said. If I don't put my name on it, there's no case. There's just a story. Warren picked up his fork again. Thought. Then Hackett's going to come here first. Before he goes to Coldridge, he'll track the trail. I know. He'll come with men. He'll come with Big Ven and Creed. Possibly Lars if Lars is committed fully. 3, maybe 4. And we're one man who can't lift his left arm above his shoulder, one woman, and one man who is 60 years old and getting there. Warren said it without bitterness. Just the ledger. Those are not favorable numbers for an open confrontation. No, Holt said. But we're in a fixed position and they have to come to us. And Regan has a better eye than either of Hackett's hired men. I watched her put a shot under pressure on the mountain. Warren looked at Regan. That's true, he said simply. Regan said nothing. She was looking at the window, reading the light. If he tracked us last night, he tracked us in the storm. Trail markers get buried in 6 inches of fresh powder. He'll be moving slow and uncertain. We have more time than it feels like. Then we use it, Warren said. He pushed back from the table. I'll check the barn and the fence lines. You'll know if they've circled before they knock on the door. He stood, picked up his hat from its hook. Looked at Holt once more. You sleeping on my floor? Last night, Holt said. Yes, tonight depends on what happens today. Warren opened the door. Don't break anything else while I'm outside. He went out. Regan looked at the closed door, then at the table in front of her. Then, with some restraint that was visible in the set of her shoulders, she almost smiled. He likes you, she said. He thinks I'm useful, Holt said. With my father, those are the same thing. She started clearing the table. Holt stood to help and she didn't stop him and she didn't thank him, both of which were the right responses. They worked in the functional coordination of people who have been in close quarters long enough to know which way the other person moves. Then she stopped and turned around and looked at him with something direct enough that he stopped too. The carved piece, she said. He waited. You don't have to tell me, she said. I'm not asking for the whole story. I'm asking one specific thing, because it affects what I think about what you're planning to do. She met his eyes without flinching from his. Is there someone on that mountain waiting for you to come back? The question was so specific and so carefully bounded that it deserved the same kind of answer. No, he said. There's no one on that mountain. There hasn't been anyone in 4 years. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to confirm she'd heard the weight of that. Then she turned back to the table. All right, she said. Just all right. Not sorry for your loss, and not I had a feeling, and not anything that he would have had to absorb and store somewhere. Just all right, which meant she had the information she needed and she was moving forward with it. He had not met many people in his life who communicated in exactly the shape of what was necessary. The light outside shifted and they both felt it. The particular flattening of the midday light into afternoon, the way the snow-reflected brightness went gray-yellow as the sun moved west of the ridgeline. Holt went to the south window and looked out. The trail was visible from here, the line of it cutting south through the timber toward the valley road, nothing moving on it. The snow surface was undisturbed in both directions. He went to the north window. The trail from the north was also clear. But the north was where it would come from if it came, and the north trail was longer and the trees were thicker on that side, and a person could be a quarter mile up the north trail before the cabin window would show them. He stood at the north window for a while. Warren came back in with cold on his coat and said the barn was solid and the horses were settled, and he'd found a second spot to stand from if it came to that, behind the woodpile on the east side, which gave a right-side angle on the north approach. He said this to Holt and Regan both. The way someone briefs people on a plan they've been thinking about for longer than the conversation has been happening. He'd clearly been thinking about defensive positions since before he'd left Coldridge, which meant he'd known this was coming. You expected Hackett to move on you, Holt said. Warren took his coat off and hung it. I expected it when the deeds went missing the second time. I came back early because I expected Hackett to move while I was in town. The timing suited him. He poured himself coffee. I didn't expect him to move on a guide first, but I should have. He doesn't leave witnesses. The afternoon worked its way toward 3 o'clock. Nothing came down the North Trail. Regan saddled Dusty at 2:30 without announcing she was going to them. Holt heard the barn door and went to the window and watched her lead the horse out, check the cinch with 2 fingers under the strap the way experienced riders check it, and swing up with the single fluid motion of someone who does not think about mounting. She'd added a second pistol to her belt in a cross-draw holster on the left side. Her rifle was in the saddle scabbard. She had a leather satchel across her body. He went outside. She looked down at him from Dusty's back. She was wearing her full riding clothes, the heavy split skirt, the vest, the hat straight this time for some reason, and the late afternoon light was coming through the pines at a low angle, and it made everything copper and long-shadowed. "I'm going to Coldridge," she said. "Ed Pryor needs to hear this from a person before Hackett gets back. And someone needs to send a rider to Cannon City tonight. You'll pass Hackett on the Valley Road." Hackett came from the north approach. "He's not on the Valley Road yet." She settled her weight in the saddle. "He'll track us up here and find an empty nest, which will buy more time. But I need to be in Coldridge before dark. I should go with you." She looked at him with an expression that took in his wrapped ribs, his left arm's limited range of motion, and the general condition of a man who had spent the previous night on a cabin floor after being buried in snow for several hours. "You need to be here when he arrives," she said. "My father is 60 years old. He needs someone who can back him up, and you are what's available." He didn't argue with the logic. He hated the logic. "Ed Pryor," he said. "I know how to find Ed Town. Pass him in personally, if he needs that." She looked at him for a moment, something recalculating. "Will you? I'll come into Coldridge when this is done and stand in front of whoever needs to hear it." He said it with the specific weight of a commitment rather than a reassurance. "Tell him that." She held his gaze, nodded once. Then she turned Dusty south through the trees without looking back, and the sound of the hooves compressed into the snow and faded, and then there was just the pines and the late light and the North Trail. He stood looking at the North Trail for a moment. Then he went back inside. Warren was cleaning his rifle at the table, methodical and quiet. He did not look up. Holt took his own pistol out of the holster and set it on the table and checked it over with the same care, the cylinder and the action and the barrel, and sat down across from Warren with both weapons between them on the table and the fire building behind him. "She'll be fine," Warren said to the rifle. "I know," Holt said to the pistol. Neither of them said anything after that for a while. The light outside went from copper to gray. The fire filled the space the daylight had been using. Holt made himself eat something from what was in the cabin, not because he was hungry, but because he was going to need whatever his body could convert. And he stayed near the north window while he ate and watched the trail. At 20 minutes past 4, he saw movement, not much. The flicker of something dark through the white and gray of the trees, at the edge of where the North Trail bent around the big fir. He set the plate down and said one word, and Warren stood up from the chair with his rifle in a single motion that made Holt think about the war this man had survived and recalibrate accordingly. "How many?" Warren said quietly at the window. "One visible. There'll be more behind. East side, or they come straight. Hackett likes a show, he'll come straight." Holt picked up his Colt. "Go east. Give me the window." Warren went out the back with the controlled quiet of a man who has made himself small and still under pressure before, and knows the body knowledge required. Holt heard the back door close without a sound. He stood at the north window. They came out of the trees at the trail bend and down the last 50 yards to the cabin clearing, and there were 3 of them. Hackett in the center, his dark vest incongruous against the snow in the way that city clothes always looked incongruous in this landscape. His posture carrying the quality of someone who had decided the encounter was already over and was proceeding through the formality of its conclusion. Big Ven to his left, heavy coat, his breath a visible cloud. Creed to right with the rifle across his saddle at an angle that was not exactly pointed at the cabin, and was not exactly not pointed at the cabin. No Lars. Which meant Lars was either in Coldridge or had decided this particular errand was beneath his official capacity. Hackett pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin with the searching attention of someone checking an address. Then he looked at the window. Holt stepped back from the glass, not out of fear, out of the basic tactical logic that a man standing in a lit window is a man offering a target. Hackett's voice carried across the clearing without effort, the practiced projection of a man who had given speeches in large rooms. "I know you're in there, Danver." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm going to be honest with you. What happened on the mountain was a business decision. You were a liability to a significant investment, and I acted to protect that investment. I don't expect you to be happy about it. A pause. But the situation has changed. You're still alive, which changes what's possible. I'm prepared to make you an offer that reflects your value as someone who knows the northern range. Holt said nothing. He moved to the left of the window, where he could see the clearing at an angle without being visible from it. Big Ven shifted his horse, restless, and Holt watched the way the shift moved through the group. Creed's rifle angle hadn't changed. Hackett was watching the window with the patience of someone who is very sure of his position. He was very sure of his position because he thought he was facing one injured man and one old rancher. He did not know about the woodpile. The offer is simple, Hackett continued. You file a surveyor's affidavit placing the deposit on the Cross property, not the federal land, the Cross property. Warren Cross receives a reasonable payment for the mineral rights. You receive a finder's percentage on extraction, and we all move forward without any further unpleasantness. He paused. The alternative is considerably less pleasant for everyone involved. From the east side of the cabin, past the woodpile, came Warren Cross's voice. Even in carrying them. You're trespassing them. Hackett's horse moved 2 steps sideways before the man got it under control. He had not known Warren Cross was outside. The recalculation showed in the set of his shoulders, just briefly. Mr. Cross, Hackett said, turning slightly. This doesn't need to involve your property or your family. You tried to kill a man and leave him on my land, Warren said. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature. That involved my property and my family. Creed's rifle moved, just slightly, coming more toward the woodpile direction. Holt opened the cabin door. He stepped out onto the threshold with his Colt visible and his weight distributed the way a man distributes it when he expects to need it somewhere, and isn't sure exactly where yet. The cold hit him immediately, but he didn't show it. His ribs were a specific fire in his left side that he catalogued and set aside. He looked at Hackett across the clearing. Hackett looked back at him with something that was not surprise exactly. More like the adjustment of a man who has encountered a variable he'd assigned a low probability to, Mr. Danver. The tone was recalibrating, still controlled, still carrying the shape of someone who believed he was managing the situation. You look considerably better than I expected. The mountain didn't cooperate, Holt said. Something flickered in Hackett's expression at that. A brief and genuine irritation that broke through the surface before the surface reasserted itself. My offer stands, Hackett said. I don't need this to become complicated. Holt looked at him across the snow. He looked at the dark vest and the gold watch chain at the pocket and the careful way the man sat his horse. The posture of someone who had bought his way into enough situations to believe purchase was the solution to most problems. He thought about the hollow in the snow. He thought about the sound the packed snow had made when it finally gave way. He thought about Regan Cross pulling on that rope in a December storm for a man she'd never met because it was the right thing to do. He thought about all the ranchers who had sold their land. The Henderson place, Holt said, the Pittman widow. Aldred's. He watched Hackett's face. How complicated was it when they sold? Hackett's expression did not change, which was its own answer. I'm not interested in your offer, Holt said. What I'm interested in is whether you ride back to Coldridge right now, which gives you a small window before the United States Marshal's office has a very detailed report about what happened on that mountain. You have no proof, Hackett said. Even now, still controlled. I have 2 broken ribs and a face full of evidence in a county that has been watching its property records disappear for 6 months. He kept his voice level, not angry. Anger was heat and he was going for cold. You had a plan and the plan required a body. There isn't a body. Everything that follows from that is your problem. Big Ven moved his horse again. Less restless now, more purposeful. Holt tracked it in his peripheral vision without moving his eyes off Hackett. East side, Warren said quietly. To Creed. Creed turned his head and saw Warren Cross behind the woodpile with a rifle resting on the top row of split logs, pointed at a very specific location. Creed made a decision in approximately 2 seconds, and the decision was visible in the way his own rifle angle shifted. Neither at Holt nor at Warren, but somewhere neutral. The decision of a hired man recalculating whether the pay scale covered this particular level of exposure. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had made a very specific kind of mistake, which was the mistake of underestimating what one woman with a rope could do in a storm, and everything that had followed from that mistake was arriving at him now simultaneously. This isn't finished, Hackett said, pulling his horse around. No, Holt said. It isn't, Hackett rode out. Big Ven followed, Creed followed, and when he was 20 yards out, he turned back once to look at the position Warren had held, then kept moving. The 3 horses went back up the north trail, and the pines closed around them, and the clearing was just the clearing again. with the evening light going blue in the shadows and the wood smoke rising straight up in the still air. Warren came around from the woodpile with his rifle loose in his hand and looked at the tree line for a long moment. Holt came down off the threshold into the snow. "He'll go to Lars," Warren said. "Or Lars comes to him. Either way." Holt holstered the Colt. "We have until morning, maybe less." Warren looked at him. "My daughter needs to reach Ed Pryor before Hackett reaches Coldridge." "She left 2 hours ago," Holt said. "She's already there." Warren Cross looked at the north tree line one more time. Then he nodded once, with the finality of a man crossing something off a list, and walked back to the cabin. Holt stood in the clearing for a moment. The light was almost gone. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees in the past hour, the kind of drop that was less weather event and more the mountain simply asserting its nature. His left side was talking to him in a sustained, specific, deeply unpleasant way. He breathed through it and looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to emerge in the strip of clear black above the ridge. The North Star was where it always was, fixed and cold and entirely indifferent to the various human arrangements happening below it. He went back inside. That night was different from the night before. Warren Cross slept in his own bed, which was his right, and Holt had the floor again, but the quality of the night had changed. The storm was gone and the cold was the clear, dry cold of open sky at elevation, and everything outside was very still. No wind, just temperature. The fire worked harder for less effect, and Holt lay in his coat and listened to the silence and thought about what Regan was doing in Coldridge. He thought about her walking into Ed Pryor's print shop with her hat still on, and that satchel across her body, and laying out the situation with the same systematic accuracy she used for everything else. He thought about Pryor, who he knew by reputation as a man not easily impressed or frightened, listening to a 25-year-old woman describe a coordinated land fraud and attempted murder, and deciding whether the story was true. He thought about what she would say to make him believe it. He thought she probably wouldn't need to say much. Some people you believe before they finish the sentence because the way they speak has the weight of only saying what they know. The pine piece was flat against his sternum, and he was aware of it the way he was always aware of it. The particular small pressure that had become so habitual it was more absence when removed than presence when there. He thought about what Regan had asked him, the specificity of it. Not "Are you over it?" or "Do you still miss her?" or any of the questions that people ask when they want to express sympathy and don't know how. Just, "Is there someone waiting?" No, no one waiting. He lay with that for a while. There was a version of the next several years that looked like this: go back up the mountain after this was done. File the evidence. Testify if needed. Watch Hackett get removed from the territory by federal authority. And then go back up the mountain. The cabin was still there. The trapping territories were still registered in his name. The mountain was exactly as he'd left it, which it always was, because the mountain had no investment in whether Holt Danver was on it or not. He tried to make that version feel like a plan. He lay on the floor of Warren Cross's cabin and listened to the silence, and tried to make going back up the mountain feel like the right next thing. And what he found was that the mental image of it had a quality it hadn't had before. A 4-year-old quality. The quality of something that had been sufficient for what it was, which was not the same as for sufficient for what came next. He pressed the pine flat and closed his eyes. In the morning Regan would come back from Coldridge with whatever Ed Pryor had agreed to. Warren would have a position on what happened after that. Hackett would be making his own calculations in whatever room he was making them in. Lars would be deciding, if he hadn't already, how much of himself he'd invested in Boyd Hackett's version of events. All of that was tomorrow he slept. He did not dream about fire. He dreamed about a north window and a trail coming clear in the morning light. And someone moving through the trees toward the cabin. And the specific way a person who knows what they're doing moves through deep snow. And he woke at first light feeling like something had shifted in the night without making any noise. The way a river shifts its channel underground, and the surface doesn't show it until spring. Warren was already up. The fire was already built. 2 cups on the table. Holt sat up and Warren looked at him and said, "She's coming up the south trail." He went to the south window. Dusty's dark chestnut shape was visible through the pines, moving at a steady pace. And Regan was in the saddle with her hat on and the morning light on her shoulders. And she was moving with the posture of someone who has accomplished what they went to do. He did not examine too closely the particular quality of the feeling that produced them. She came in with cold on her coat and the satchel heavier than it had been when she left. And she set it on the table and opened it and laid out what she'd brought, 3 printed pages in Ed Pryor's type. draft copies of the story he was holding for the morning run, a letter on official paper from the county recorder's office, which meant Billings had decided, with Pryor's moral support, to put something in writing, and a copy of the documentary record she and Ed had assembled, duplicated for the U.S. Marshal's office in Cannon City, the original already gone with the rider at midnight. Rider left at midnight, she said. She sat down, she accepted the coffee Warren held out and drank it and then looked at both of them. Ed will run the story day after tomorrow. He wants Holt in Coldridge by then. She looked at Holt directly. He wants you standing in that town when people read it. I know, Holt said. He was very specific, so am I. He looked at her across the table. I'll be there. Warren Cross read the draft pages without hurrying and without expression. He read Billings' letter twice, hid the envelope address once and set it aside. Then he folded his hands on the table and looked at the two people sitting across from him and said, Boyd Hackett came here last night. Regan's eyes went to Holt. He came with his men, Holt said. He made an offer. We declined it. She looked at him for another moment, reading the subtext of that summary. Then she looked at the table and breathed once, slow. He went to Lars after, presumably. Then we have until Ed runs the story, she said. After that, Coldridge has heard both versions and decides which one it believes. Warren picked up his coffee. I know which version Coldridge will believe, he said. I've lived here 30 years. So has Boyd Hackett's money. He drank. It'll be close. It won't be close, Regan said. And she said it with the flat certainty of someone who has thought about this longer and at closer range than either man in the room. Because Hackett's version requires the town to believe that a man went up the mountain, got injured in an accident, wandered onto our land, was nursed back to health, and then decided for no reason to accuse Hackett of attempted murder. And our version requires the town to believe that a man went up the mountain, was beaten and buried, survived, and is standing in front of them telling them what happened. She set her cup down. One of those versions is a man standing in front of them. The other one is a theory. Her eyes moved to Holt, which is why Ed needs you there. He looked back at her. There was something in the air of the cabin that the fire had nothing to do with. Warren Cross was looking at his coffee cup with an expression that suggested he had decided this was a good time to be very interested in the grain of the tin. Holt said, I'll be there, and the day came up cold and clear outside the south window, and the mountain stood where it always stood, and the story that was going to be told in Coldridge was already in motion, already past the point of being stopped by anything except the ending it was building toward. They rode into Coldridge on the third day after Regan came back from her midnight errand, and the morning was the kind of clear that only comes after sustained cold has wrung every particle of moisture out of the air, leaving behind a brightness so complete it had a texture, every surface throwing back the winter light at an angle that made the town look more defined than it felt from inside it. Holt rode Warren's horse. His ribs had reached an accommodation with the wrapping, converting what had been an impossible pain into a merely significant one that he could breathe around if he was deliberate about it. He wore his trapper's coat because it was cold and it was his, and there was no pretending to be something other than what he was, not today, not in this town. His hat brim cut the glare from the snow. His colt was where it belonged, and he did not think about it consciously because thinking about it consciously was not how it worked. Regan rode Dusty on his left, both hands visible on the reins, hat straight. Warren came behind them on the road horse he'd retrieved from town stabling before dawn without mentioning it to either of them, because Warren Cross made necessary arrangements and did not announce them, and the arrangements were always correct. They came into Coldridge from the South Road at 9:30 and the town was already reading. Ed Pryor had run 200 copies the previous night, and his delivery boy, who was fast and apparently immune to cold, had reached every ranch within 4 miles before the shops opened. The Coldridge Courier's front page was visible in the window of the general store before they reached the livery. The blacksmith had a copy folded over his anvil. 2 men outside the hotel were reading the same sheet between them, heads bent together in the posture of people parsing something that changes what they thought they knew them. The hitch rail outside the sheriff's office had 2 horses on it that Holt recognized without needing to confirm the recognition. Big Ven's animal and Creed's animal, standing with the particular patience of horses who have been waiting for a while and have accepted it, which meant either Lars had them inside or Hackett had gathered them, and either way the office across the street was not an uncomplicated situation. Regan saw the horses at the same moment he did. One small adjustment of her hands on the reins. She kept moving, he kept moving, Warren kept moving, because stopping was the one available option that would cost them everything. Ed Pryor was at the courier's door before they reached it, which meant he'd been watching the South Road for the better part of an hour. He was exactly what 30 years of a printing trade in a small town produced. A man compressed to what was load-bearing. Nothing extra remaining. The essential arranged with great efficiency inside a frame that had stopped apologizing for its age some time ago. His vest was the black one Regan had described, worn past the point of restoration at both elbows. His hands were printer's hands, carrying the permanent evidence of his trade in every crease. His eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses were doing the active work of assessment before he'd said a word. He looked at Holt for 3 seconds, then, "You're bigger than I expected. People mention that," Holt said. "The men who buried you in a snowbank clearly didn't account for it." Ed held the courier door open. "Come in before Lars decides he has an official position on you standing in the street." They went in. The front room smelled of ink and dry heat and the specific industry of a man who had been working through the night. Print sheets hung from lines strung between the ceiling beams, drying in the warmth from the cast iron stove. Holt could read the headline from across the room because Ed Pryor had said it in the largest type in his inventory and had not been subtle about the choice. "Mountain man buried alive by mining company agent. Cross-brand ranch targeted in land fraud scheme. County records compromised for 6 months." Under that, in the second largest type available, eyewitness account. "Witness present in Coldridge today." Ed let them read it. Then, half already distributed. "The other half I'm handing out myself, starting when you walk out that door." He picked up a stack from the side table. "Billings came to me yesterday evening, on his own. Brought the recorder's office log going back to July. He handed the log to Warren without ceremony. 14 entries touching the cross-property deed in 6 months. A normal deed sees that kind of activity once in a decade, maybe less." Warren took the papers. His eyes were on the sheriff's office window across the street. "He was getting in through the back window," Ed continued. "Not Billings, someone with a key to the alley gate. Lars has had that key since September." He looked at Holt over his glasses. "Your deed is intact, Mr. Cross." What they were building toward was a secondary filing that would have appeared to supersede the original. They needed another 30 days, perhaps less. Warren said Lars has been receiving a monthly envelope from a Denver address since September, Ed said. "I know because the postmaster told me, and the postmaster told me because he reads the courier and trusts it and has been uneasy about that envelope for 2 months. He set the stack of papers on the counter. "Here is what I know about Coldridge. This town will believe what it sees before it believes what it reads. Print helps. A man standing in the street telling the truth in his own voice is what closes it." He looked at Holt. "So we're going to walk out that door." Holt said all right, which was everything Ed needed. They went out into the cold, bright morning and walked south down the main street of Coldridge, with Ed Pryor handing papers to every person they passed. And the town took them and read the headline and looked at the large man in the trapper's coat and made the connection the headline was designed to make them make. The sheriff's office door opened before they reached the middle of the street. Deputy Lars came out first. He stood on the top step with his badge catching the light and his face doing the arithmetic of a man who has been in a situation too long and is now doing the math on what it costs to stay in it versus what it costs to leave. Boyd Hackett came out behind him in his dark vest, the gold watch chain visible at his pocket, his posture carrying the quality of someone who has decided the encounter is a formality to be managed. Big Ven stayed in the doorway. Creed had come around the south side of the building and was visible at the corner. The street had gone quiet. Not the quiet of an empty street, the quiet of a street full of people who have stopped what they were doing. Holt walked to the middle of the street, not a theatrical choice, a practical one that gave him clear sight lines in every direction and put equal distance between himself and every building front. He stopped and turned toward the sheriff's office and looked at Boyd Hackett on the steps. Hackett looked back. "Your name is Boyd Hackett," Holt said, and his voice was level and carried without effort. The voice of a man accustomed to making himself heard across distances where no one was going to lean in to help him. 4 days ago you paid men to beat me unconscious and bury me in a snowfield on the north range above this valley, because I had witnessed the location of a mineral deposit you intended to claim without legitimate title and without witnesses. He paused 1 beat. "I am standing here because a woman from this county found me and pulled me out of that snowfield in a December storm. The mountain did not finish the work you assigned it. Something moved through the gathered crowd, not sound. The physical shift of people absorbing a reconfiguration of what they thought they knew about their own valley." Hackett's surface held, just barely. "This man has a contractual dispute with my operation," he said, the boardroom delivery still mostly intact. "He is making accusations in March," Holt said, even, flat. one at a time. Pittman Widow in June, Aldred in September, all west of the creek line, all adjacent to the mineral deposit. All approached after you had mapped the northern range and identified the deposit's location. He looked at the crowd, not for effect, but because the crowd was the point of this. Ed Pryor has the county recorder's logs. The cross-brand deed was accessed 14 times in 6 months. The insertion dates do not match the original recording dates. That is not a clerical error, that is a pattern. A man at the crowd's edge, heavyset, ranch brand on his coat, raised his hand with the slightly self-conscious gesture of someone not used to public participation. He approached me too. October. My place east of the Henderson land. His man told me the mineral survey showed a flood risk on my north pasture. I checked with the survey office. No such notation exists. From the other side, my brother sold to a Denver buyer in August. Same company name. He was told the county was planning a road easement through his east field. He's never seen a road. Hackett looked at these people, then at the papers in their hands, then at Lars. Lars was not looking at Hackett. Lars was looking at the street, at the faces of people he had lived alongside for years, at the copies of the Coldridge Courier that had reached the general store window and the hotel steps, and the hands of the blacksmith who had come to his shop door to read it. Lars was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was simple and terrible. He had to live here after today. Hackett did not. Lars took one step forward, and his voice, when it came, was not smooth. It was the voice of a man saying the thing he should have said 2 months ago, and has been carrying the weight of not saying. Boyd Hackett, I am placing you under temporary hold pending investigation of the claims being made against your operation. He looked at the doorway. Tell your men to stand down. Hackett looked at Lars for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating the reliability of a resource he'd believed was secured. Then he looked at the crowd again, at the papers. At Holt standing in the middle of the street in his trapper's coat, solid and present and very much alive. This isn't the end of it, Hackett said. Holt looked at him without heat. No, he said. The end of it is in Denver, in a federal courtroom. With documents, he held Hackett's gaze. You built your plan on paperwork. The paperwork is what takes you down. Hackett went with Lars. Not resisting, because Hackett was never a man who spent resources on gestures that cost more than they returned. He went inside with the posture of someone filing a complaint rather than being detained. And the door closed. And Big Ven and Creed exchanged a look across the width of the building, and arrived at the same conclusion independently. The pay scale for this particular situation had just changed in ways that made their continued presence in Coldridge an unreasonable professional decision. They were gone from the hitch rail before the crowd had fully turned back to itself. The street exhaled. Ed Pryor was still distributing papers from his stack with the steady efficiency of a man completing a job. The ranch brand man was talking to the general store owner, with the animation of people discovering they have been subject to the same thing, without knowing they shared it. Warren Cross was at the courier's door, and a man Holt didn't recognize came up to Warren and said something low. And Warren nodded once, and they stood looking at the sheriff's office together with the quiet solidarity of men who have been on the same piece of ground for long enough to know what it means. Holt stood in the middle of the street. His ribs were delivering their full report on the past 4 days. His face had healed enough to look like a face again rather than a record of specific impacts. The cold was real and he was standing in it without moving. But he stood another moment because something needed to finish settling before he moved. The way a structure needs a moment after the last piece is placed before you trust your weight to it. He turned and found Regan Cross at the edge of the boardwalk. She was not watching Hackett's office, not reading the paper. She was watching him, with the same quality of attention she brought to everything that mattered. Nothing performed about it. No distance between what she was doing and the fact that she was doing it. He walked to the boardwalk. She said, "You did what you said you'd do." I know what you said." He looked at her. The December light was behind her, and her hat brim cut a clean line, and her eyes were that blue-gray that the bright winter sky made almost silver. He thought about the rope and the knot she'd tied in the storm. He thought about the coffee at first light that was ready before he was awake enough to ask for it. He thought about the one question she'd asked him in the cabin, perfectly bounded, taking only what she needed to know, and leaving the rest where it lived. He reached into the chest pocket of his coat and took out the rawhide cord. The pine piece was warm from being against him, and he held it in his palm and looked at the letter carved into it and let the full weight of it be what it was. 4 years of a man doing the only thing he knew how to do after losing the person who made him know how to do anything else. May had been real. The fire had been real. The 4 years had been real. None of that required revision. None of that was something he was setting down. He closed his hand around it. Then he put it back in the chest pocket. Same place, same proximity to his heart, but held now, carried as a choice rather than worn as a sentence. Regan watched him without filling the silence. When he looked up, she said, "That's yours to keep however you need to keep it." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be done with it. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Then what are you doing?" He looked back at her, at everything she was that she had never once asked him to notice. "Ranch work in winter," he said. "What does it need?" She blinked. The recalibration of a person ready for one kind of conversation who has received a different one that turns out to be the same conversation from a different direction. What? The fence lines, the snow load on the barn roof, the east pasture rotation when the creek freezes. He held her eyes. "Those are things I can do while my ribs finish their business." Them. She was quiet long enough for 2 people to walk past them on the boardwalk without either of them noticing. After that he said, "Them. If your father has questions about the North Range, them. I know the North Range better than anyone in this valley, them. That knowledge doesn't go back up the mountain with me if I'm not going back up the mountain." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was doing the work of deciding whether the offer was what she thought it was. "You're planning to stay," she said. "I'm planning to be useful," he said. Whether that becomes staying is a question that answers itself. "It usually answers itself the same way," she said, dry and accurate and entirely Regan Cross. He almost smiled. Them. The U.S. Marshal arrived from Cannon City on the 3rd day after the confrontation in the street, which was exactly the timeline that a hard ride and a federal officer's preparation time produced. Ed Pryor had sent his most reliable rider at midnight on the day Regan came back from Coldridge, with a sealed letter outlining the situation and a copy of the documentary evidence. The rider had made Cannon City in 36 hours of hard going, and the marshal had organized himself and departed the following morning. And he arrived in Coldridge in the early afternoon of a day that was cold and clear, and felt like the kind of day on which things get officially resolved. He spent an hour in the sheriff's office and came out and found Holt in the courier's front room, where Ed Pryor had established what amounted to a field office for the duration. The marshal was a compact man in his 50s, with a face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of careful attention, and eyes that moved over everything with the practiced inventory of someone who had seen most of what people did to each other, and had decided to spend his working years in organized opposition to it. He sat across from Holt with Ed Pryor's stove, warming the space between them, and asked his questions in the sequence that a prepared federal officer asks questions, beginning with the assault and working forward through the evidence. Holt answered him with the same economy he brought to everything. The mountain, the deposit location which he gave in coordinates precise enough that the marshal wrote them down carefully and confirmed them against the notation in the survey documents. The sequence of events from the base camp through the snowfield through Regan Cross's intervention, the confrontation at the cabin, the confrontation in the street. The marshal wrote, asked follow-up questions, wrote more. At the end he said, "Hackett's 2 men, Big Ven and Creed, they left Coldridge." "They did," Holt said. "I'll need descriptions and whatever names you have." The marshal's pen was ready. Holt gave him both in the same precise detail he'd given everything else. Coloring, approximate height and weight, distinguishing features, the horses they'd ridden out on, and the direction they'd taken from what he'd been able to observe from the sheriff's office window. The marshal wrote it all and said it would go to the territorial network within the week. It was not a guarantee, but it was not nothing. And with 2 men who had been publicly identified in a federal proceeding, Coldridge was no longer comfortable territory for them regardless. "Formal testimony," the marshal said. "Denver. Federal proceeding. I can't give you a date yet, but it will be within the spring session." "I'll be there," Holt said. "Where should I send correspondence?" "1 second. The length of a decision that had already been made presenting itself as a question for the last time before it stopped being a question. Cross Brand Ranch. South Valley Road, 3.5 miles from Coldridge. The marshal wrote it down and closed his notebook and stood up. He looked at Holt with the assessing look of a federal officer calibrating the reliability of a witness. What he found in Holt Danvers' face was the same thing everyone found, which was a man who said exactly what he meant and meant exactly what he said and had no talent for performance in either direction. The marshal nodded once and put his hat on and went to deal with the paperwork that a formal detention required, and Ed Pryor watched him cross the street through the ink-fogged window and then looked at Holt and said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon, the 3 of them, south on the valley road with the light going long, and the shadows of the pines striping across the snow in parallel lines that the horses moved through without acknowledgement. Warren was ahead. Regan and Holt rode even with each other and did not say much because there was not much that required saying, the day having already said what needed saying in the street at 9:30. What needed to happen next was what happened. Holt stayed, not announced, not negotiated. He simply did not leave, and after the first week Warren Cross stopped treating him as a guest, and started treating him as someone whose presence in the barn at 5 in the morning was a fact of the ranch rather than a courtesy. Warren's method of signaling this transition was to stop explaining where things were, and start expecting Holt to know, which Holt interpreted correctly and responded to by learning where things were, with the same systematic attention he'd given to learning the mountain. The fence lines were his first project because they were the most pressing. Post by post, rail by rail, the tension of the wire and the depth of the anchor and the geometry of corner posts under diagonal stress. He found 3 sections that would not have made it through February without failure, and rebuilt them from the footings, working in cold that would have kept most men inside, and that he did not notice in any way that changed his pace. Regan worked alongside him on the days when the cattle didn't require her elsewhere, and they fell into the functional rhythm of people who have figured out which way the other person moves without having had a conversation about it. She taught him the herd without teaching it, moving through the work in his proximity and letting his observation do what observation did when the person doing it was paying attention. He learned which animals needed watching and why. He learned the creek boundary and the east pasture logic and the particular way the crossbrand's grazing rotation had been designed by someone, probably Warren, who had thought carefully about what the land could sustain through a hard winter. He found himself thinking on a Tuesday morning in January, while he was setting a corner post in ground that had frozen to 18 inches, that he had not thought about going back to the mountain in several days. Not a decision, just an absence of the thought. The way a sound you've stopped hearing reveals itself in the silence when you notice the silence. He drove the post and moved to the next one. The formal proceedings in Denver were scheduled for the 3rd week of March, which gave the federal court time to prepare its case and gave Hackett's attorney time to prepare his response, which the marshal had indicated would involve a claim of contractual dispute and an assertion that Holt's injuries were sustained in an accidental fall rather than an assault. Holt received this information through the marshal's correspondence and found he was not particularly concerned by it. A contractual dispute did not explain 14 entries in the county recorder's log. An accidental fall did not explain Big Ven and Creed being in the sheriff's office when Holt walked into Coldridge. Warren read the marshal's letter and set it on the table and said, "Denver in March." 3 days' ride, Holt said. "I'll go with you, you don't need to." Warren looked at him with the expression he used for things that did not require argument because they were already decided. "I'll go with you," he said again and picked up his coffee. The Henderson land question moved more slowly than the criminal proceeding, which was the nature of property law, and had been the nature of property law since there had been property law, and there was no point being frustrated by it. Ed Pryor covered it in the Courier with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had decided this story was not finished until the land was back where it belonged, and his coverage created the kind of sustained community attention that made it difficult for the legal machinery to quietly lose interest. The Pittman widow, who had moved to her daughter's place in Pueblo after the forced sale, was located by the marshal's office in February and informed that her situation had changed in ways that warranted her attention. What she would do with that information was her decision, and it was a decision she deserved to make with full knowledge of the facts, which she had not previously had. Aldred was still in the county, running a reduced operation on the east side of the valley, and Holt saw him twice at the general store in February, and both times Aldred looked at him with the expression of a man who does not know how to say what he wants to say, and is waiting for the right moment to figure it out. Holt did not press it, the right moment would come or it wouldn't. Denver in March was exactly as Holt had described it to Regan the previous December, which was the only time he'd been there, loud, and full of buildings, and operating at a pace that felt like an argument with itself. He and Warren rode in on a Sunday and testified on Monday and Tuesday, and the federal proceeding had the quality of all formal legal processes, which was that it moved with great deliberation toward conclusions that had been obvious to everyone in the room since the first document was entered into evidence. Boyd Hackett sat at the defendant's table in his dark vest, which had been brushed and pressed for the occasion, and his attorney made the arguments that had been prepared, and Holt sat in the witness chair and answered every question with the same flat accuracy he brought to everything, And when the cross-examination attempted to characterize his injuries as consistent with a fall, rather than an assault, he described the geometry of the hollow, the angle of the impacts on his face and skull, and the specific weight distribution of packed mountain snow, as distinct from fall impact snow in terms that the court reporter transcribed carefully, and that Hackett's attorney did not pursue further. Warren testified about the deed records, about the approaches to buy the ranch, about Deputy Laws and the envelope from Denver, which Laws himself had already described in a voluntary statement that the marshal's office had accepted in exchange for a reduction in Laws's own exposure. They rode back to the ranch on a Thursday. Regan was checking the east fence line when they came up the valley road, and she turned Dusty and rode to meet them and looked at Warren first, then at Holt, reading both of them the way she read everything. It went, Warren said. Verdict, she said. 60 days for the court to deliberate formally, Holt said. But the marshal told me afterward off the record that the property fraud case is closed. The assault charge depends on the court's reading of the testimony, but the fraud is done. She held his eyes for a moment, nodded once, then turned Dusty back toward the fence line. He swung down from Warren's horse and tied it and went to help her with the fence. Spring arrived the way spring arrived in that valley, which was not a single event but a negotiation conducted over 6 weeks between the mountain's preference and the season's insistence. The snow retreating by inches from the lower pastures while the high ridgeline held white into May. The mud came first, making every surface uncertain and every task twice as physical, and then the green came under the mud, and then one morning in late April the green was on top and the mud was under it, and the valley looked like it had been intending this all along. Holt rebuilt the barn's north-facing wall in April, which had been shedding its chinking for 2 winters and had finally progressed to a draft problem. He did it the way he did everything, methodically and without making an occasion of it. And when it was done, Warren ran his hand along the new chinking and said, better than it was when I built it. 3 words of assessment from Warren Cross being the rough equivalent of a formal commendation from anyone else. The Denver court's ruling came in a letter in the 3rd week of May. The fraud conviction was complete. The assault charge carried a sentence that the letter described in the careful language of federal jurisprudence, and that amounted, in plain terms, to Boyd Hackett spending a meaningful portion of the next several years in a federal facility in Colorado Territory, which was not Cannon City and was not Denver and was not anywhere that had a view of the northern range. Ed Pryor ran a front page. The Henderson family's land case was in active proceeding with the county recorder's office, with Billings, who had made his choice and was now making good on it with the thoroughness of a man trying to balance a ledger that had been running crooked for too long. The Pittman widow had engaged an attorney in Pueblo. These things moved at the speed they moved, and Holt had made his peace with that speed because the alternative was impatience, and impatience was not a productive response to processes that were, in their slow way, running correctly. He said as much to Regan one evening in June, when they were sitting on the south-facing bench Warren had built against the cabin's exterior wall, a spot that caught the last hour of evening light, and had been used for exactly this purpose for as long as the bench had existed. She was looking at the east pasture where the herd was settled for the evening. He was looking at the same thing. You're patient about it, she said. The law is slow, he said. Ed told me that in December. He was right. You didn't used to be patient. He thought about that. I used to be good at waiting, he said. That's not the same thing, she looked at him. What's the difference? Waiting is just time passing, he said. Patience is knowing what the time is for. She held his eyes for a moment and he could see the thing happening in her expression that happened when something landed in the right place. The small internal acknowledgement that did not need to be performed because it was real. She turned back to the pasture. They sat in the evening light and the pasture did what pastures do in June in a well-run valley, which is exist in a condition of sustainable abundance that is the result of years of careful work and looks, from the outside, like simply being there. September came with its first cold mornings, and its aspens beginning their annual argument with green, a few yellow leaves appearing in the high stands as early as the 2nd week, the mountain asserting its own calendar over the valleys. He was resetting the corner post of the east fence's south run, the one he'd flagged in the winter as needing attention before the ground froze again, working the post with a methodical rotation that drove it another 2 inches into the hardening soil with each sequence. Regan had ridden the fence line north and would circle back. He could hear Dusty's hoofbeats through the ground before he could hear them through the air, a skill he'd developed on the mountain and had not stopped using them. She pulled up on the south side of the fence line and sat looking at the post he was working on for a moment. Then she looked at him. "There's something you should know," she said. He set his weight against the post and looked up at her. She told him. The aspens above the creek were yellow in the morning light, and the September air had the first real edge of coming winter in it, and the post was solid under his hands, and everything she'd said was settling into itself in the space between them with the weight of something true and specific and requiring response. He looked at her on Dusty, watching him, not filling the silence, not asking him to be faster than he was going to be. This was one of the things he had learned about Regan Cross in the months since December, one of the specific and irreplaceable things. She understood that a person needed the time they needed to say the true thing, and she did not mistake silence for absence. He let go of the post and straightened up. He reached into his chest pocket and held the rawhide cord in his fist for one moment, feeling the weight of the pine piece inside his hand. May, the fire. 4 years. All real, all present, all something he carried honestly and would carry for the rest of whatever came, not as a sentence but as the truth of how a person becomes what they are. He put the cord back, looked at Regan. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Not for her reassurance, because it was simply the true thing, and the true thing was what needed to be said. That was settled in December when I told the marshal where to find me. Everything since then has been me being here. This is just more of me being here. She looked at him from Dusty's back with something in her expression that she had been holding behind the directness for months, something that had been waiting for a moment that earned it, and now the moment had come and she let it be visible. It was not dramatic. It was just Regan Cross looking at something she was glad existed. "I know," she said. "I've known since January." He looked at her. "January. When you rebuilt the barn wall without being asked," she said. "A man who plans to leave doesn't care how the barn wall is chinked." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he turned back to the fence post and set his hands on it, and drove it the last inch and a half it needed, and the ground held it, and it was done. He moved to the next post and checked the tension of the wire between them, and it was correct, and he moved on. Regan turned Dusty along the fence line and moved with him, and the aspens were yellow above the water, and the mountain stood where it had always stood, and between a woman on a dark chestnut horse and a man working a fence line, the future was a thing they were already in, not approaching but arrived, and it looked like a Tuesday in September with the work at hand and the ground solid underfoot and the next post waiting in the clear morning air.